Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So if you think that you don't have to worry about duplicate vendors because your accounting system or ERP catches them, just know that you probably have some duplicate vendors. Why? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 397. 4 reasons why this statement, "my accounting system catches duplicates," is wrong. I do want to start off by saying I'm not talking about systems where duplicate vendors are required for like partnering, like SAP. I understand that duplicate vendors are required. I've worked with SAP. Uh, Actually 2 instances of SAP. And so it's harder at that point to find the duplicates. It can be done as you're cleaning your vendor master file, but not really talking about that system today. I am also not talking about the duplicates that are required in other systems for like address records, duplicate locations, duplicate site IDs, right? Those are all required because vendors have multiple addresses, they have multiple payment methods. What I am talking about is what some systems call the header record, where all the address IDs, the location IDs, the site IDs are all tied to that header record that has a unique taxpayer identification number. Now, in a perfect world, you have the configuration of your accounting system or ERP set up to only allow one unique taxpayer identification number in your vendor master file. And that does help to control duplicates. The problem is that duplicates still seep in, even when you say, and maybe your system does have some mechanism for catching duplicates. So even when you say, my accounting system catches duplicates, they are most likely duplicate vendors. And let me just say that I work with clients to revise or redesign their vendor process, right? Plugging up those gaps so they do not allow in fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. And I've had several of them tell me before that, well, you don't have to worry about duplicates. My system catches duplicates. And as a part of the review, I asked to see how that is configured. And so that's going to be one of the 4 reasons why you may still have duplicates. So let's go ahead and get started. And again, I don't know if I said it before, but I have 4 reasons why, right? Your system can still have duplicate vendors, even if it has some type of mechanism to catch them. All right. And so the first of the four reasons is about that. The mechanism or whatever configuration is supposed to catch them. And so the first thing that I ask when I'm working with clients to redesign their vendor process, right, to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data, duplicate vendors, right, trying to avoid those. And so when they say that their system will catch duplicate vendors, I ask to see the back end. And the one particular one, and this happens all the time. So I mean, it's something that you may not even think about looking at, but you really do need to look at how the system is identifying duplicates, like how it's configured to do that. And so this one particular one that I am remembering, for some reason, was only set up to look at or compare what was being keyed in the address fields to the addresses that were already on the vendor record. And what I recommend to find duplicates when you're adding a vendor or when you're updating an existing vendor, because that's a great time to find duplicates too, is to check for three things. The first one is the tax ID, right? Because it should be a unique tax ID, taxpayer identification number per vendor master file. Shouldn't allow more than one. So check by tax ID. Then also check by vendor legal name, and then also check by addresses. Now, in order to check by vendor legal name and addresses, you need to make sure that when you're onboarding vendors or keying in vendors into the vendor master file, that you're standardizing both the vendor legal name and then also the address. And so use the same resource, for example, for the address. If you're using USPS, their address lookup tool, have everyone use that same resource so that they're all putting in the addresses the same way. And then you can definitely search by address for duplicates. And for vendors, vendors' legal names, have a legal name convention document so that everyone is putting in the vendor's name the same way. And so that way, you can check by vendor's legal name, you can check by vendor's address. Because it is standardized. And of course, the taxpayer ID is a taxpayer ID. And so you really need to look at all three of those to make sure that there are no duplicates, because if anything was fat fingered, you have at least two other pieces of data to compare it to find those duplicates. And so in that case of my accounting system catches duplicates, it really doesn't, because it was only looking at the address. And I thought we all actually were surprised at that, because they thought it also checked on the taxpayer identification number. And to be fair, when you looked at the configuration, you could select which fields. I think they had two different fields that you can select to compare to verify whether or not it was a duplicate vendor based on duplicate data being entered or data being entered that already existed in the vendor master file. So that's the first reason, is that it's really not checking each of the fields that you need to check to verify that the vendor is not a duplicate vendor. All right, so that was reason number one. Now, reason number two is probably the cause of reason number one, and that is that vendor data is just miskeyed. And so if there are mistakes on, one or two of those points that you are supposed to check duplicates by, meaning the taxpayer identification number, the vendor legal name, and the address, typically no one's going to miskey all three of those. But if they do, yeah, you're not going to be able to find a duplicate vendor. And so, even if the system is configured to look at all three, it's just not going to find it, because you have too many data points that are miskeyed. All right, so that's the second one. Now, the third one, you may not really think about, but it is because the vendor's data is stale. And so I always talk about cleaning your vendor master file. And, I recommend that you clean it on a monthly basis. If you can't do it monthly, then do it quarterly. If you can't do it quarterly, then do it twice a year. And at the very least, at least do it on an annual basis. And I actually really think that that is too long because if you look at the 8 steps that I have for cleaning your vendor master file, a couple of those steps have to do with regulatory requirements. And so if you don't do them but once a year, your company could be susceptible to fines. And so I will put a link to a free training that I have on that process, 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. And I really think it needs to be done monthly because one of the things that you do actually is step number one, and it is to inactivate vendors that you have not done business with in whatever threshold you find works for your company. At the very least, number of months is 15 because you don't want to go down to 12 because then you'll catch those annual vendors in there. You could, I guess, go to 13 months, but I usually recommend 15 months, 18 months at the very longest, right? 24 months. I do have some clients and I know of some teams that will use 36 months, but the key is that the lower the threshold of inactivity months, the less vendors that you have, less active vendors you have in your vendor master file that could be available for both internal and external fraud. So reduce the number of active vendors in your vendor master file, and you'll be able to reduce some of the potential fraud. Now, the vendor data is stale. So if you have not inactivated, for example, your vendor inactive vendors, and they're still sitting there, the reason that you inactivate your vendors is because you cannot be sure that their information is still good. Vendors merge, they change their names, they change their tax IDs, they move. And so if you receive, let's say if your company did business with a vendor back in 2023, and right now it's 2026, and that vendor is not inactivated. But between 2023 and 2026, the vendor changed their legal name because they rebranded. They changed their tax ID because maybe they wanted a different structure. And let's just say they stayed at the same address. So you have the vendor legal name is different, the vendor tax ID is different, but they stayed at the same address. And so now you have an internal employee that wants to do business with this vendor. Maybe they don't know what the vendor was in the past because it's a different internal employee that wants to do business with the vendor. And so what are they going to do? They're probably, if you've trained them correctly, will look in the vendor master file, do a search for that vendor to see if they come up by what, of course, vendor legal name, because that's probably what they will search by. And you know what? They're not going to find it because that vendor changed their name. Now, and some of you may allow them to look by tax ID. And if they did that, they're not going to find them. And so if they did search by address, they would find them. But you know what? It will come up with a totally different vendor name and a totally different tax ID. Hopefully, it is masked. And that means that they may assume that, you know what? This is a whole different vendor. And so they're going to go back to the vendor and they are going to either ask for the W-9 or the applicable W-8 because that's what they do. If they collect the documents on behalf of the vendor and then send them to the vendor team, or they may send a request over to you that a new vendor needs to be set up, and then you or your team will send over the documents that are required for vendor setup. And if you're not looking for all three criteria, you're not going to find that the address exists, and then review uh, the vendor record and then reach out to the vendor and see if that's them. You probably, if you're not looking for the address, you're going to miss that step. And so what's going to happen? That new vendor or that vendor, existing vendor, that technically is a new vendor anyway because they have a new tax ID, but that new vendor is going to be set up and it's not going to be related at all to the existing vendor with their old name and their old tax ID. And this one is a little bit of a twist because even if you found that it's the same vendor, right? You put two and two together that there are two vendor records with the same vendor. The vendor just happened to change their legal name and tax ID. Because they changed their tax ID, it would be a new record anyway. But the key is that you do need to make sure that you know that the existing vendor record is them too, so that you can inactivate it because that vendor is no longer a going concern. So you always want to make sure that one, you are inactivating existing vendor records that are still active for vendors that have updated their information, updated their tax ID. And you always want to make sure that you are inactivating stale vendors when you're doing your vendor master file cleanup so that these types of things won't have to be found because that vendor would have been inactivated in the first place. And so you don't want to rely on a vendor changing their information and finding it that way. You want to make sure that you inactivate the vendor as soon as their record becomes stale. But because that vendor was active, that means that when you add in that new vendor with the new legal name, with the new vendor legal name, with the new tax ID, technically, if you don't find that first vendor or existing vendor record, now you have two duplicates. And the bad part is if you're not searching for duplicates based on addresses, then you won't find it and you will have duplicates in your vendor master file that you are not aware of. All right. And the fourth reason why the statement, my accounting system catches duplicates, is wrong is because what I have found, and your system can be different, but what I have seen is that some systems, when they have these warnings that there is a duplicate vendor record or there is a duplicate, that warning can be overwritten. And so the particular client that that I was working with, that where I talked about, we looked at what was behind their configuration. I've looked at quite a few, but there was this one, and again, this one stood out not only because it was the configuration for the warning was not complete, but the warning itself was a soft warning, so it could be overwritten. And they often did override it because there were certain circumstances surrounding like the vendor account or vendor group that it was in, that it would allow duplicate vendors because this vendor, the duplicate vendor was paying for or was under one different account versus another account. Don't remember now, but these accounting system or ERPs, right? You can have duplicate vendors in different accounts, different categories, different company codes. However, this particular client had the same. The vendors were in the same account. They just, had a uh, kind of a written policy that it could be overrode if the vendor in that same account or same category was for a certain type of payment. It was either a certain type of payment or a certain department within their company. And so it was just in their processes that they would allow uh, two vendors or the exact same vendor to have two different vendor records. And I don't remember if they put any type of an indicator on the vendor record, like which one should be used. I think they did. I just don't remember what it was. But the problem is that you still have duplicate vendors. They are not separated based on something that's configured in the system, like an account where it's account or category or group where it's technically separated in the vendor master file. And so the fact that the system itself allow duplicate vendors is just a soft warning, means that even in error, a vendor team member can still set up duplicate vendors because that warning is there and they just override it. And so my recommendation is that you set up the taxpayer identification number to be the unique identifier in the vendor master file so that the system will only allow one. In most systems, you can configure that, and the vendor legal name and the vendor address can then also be used to search for duplicates in case that taxpayer identification number is fat fingered. And if you have a system that has warnings, make sure that the warning for a duplicate tax ID is not a soft warning. Make sure that you can't override that. And then if you have a soft warning for vendor legal name, soft warning for an address, then make sure that you have steps in place to verify whether or not that vendor is a duplicate vendor or not based on legal name and address. So there needs to be more research done because it could be, and I could see this especially with a vendor legal name. Actually, it could be with vendor legal name or address too. You could have multiple vendor legal names the same, but maybe there is a different, I don't know, structure behind it. So you could have Acme Inc., you could have Acme Company, right? And they could be different vendors, but you do need to do the research. And the same thing with the address too. We have lots of buildings out there that have multiple vendors in the building. They're just separated by suite numbers. And so maybe the suite number wasn't added. So that could definitely be that could be overwritten. Is appropriate, but just make sure you have the steps in place so that the team members do the relevant and adequate research to make sure that they're not setting up a duplicate vendor record. All right, so those are the four reasons why this statement, my accounting system catches duplicates, is wrong. And you know what? There are probably more than that, more than four reasons, but those are what I have seen. And if you have additional reasons, I would love to hear about them. So make sure you check the show notes for my email address and email me. So don't forget that I do have a link to the training session for 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. So you can get that vendor data that is stale, those vendor records, you can inactivate those. All right. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 397th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.